Welcome to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski. We all remember playing outside when we were 9 years old, simple games of hide and seek. But today's guest had a different experience when she was 9 years old. Her father sat her down at the age of 9 to prepare her in the event that he was murdered one day. She spent 90% of her childhood terrified for him. In the 1980s and 1970s, it was a very violent time. And it was also a contradiction in that some kids weren't allowed to play with her, or she was just typecast. People were judging her family as they would watch mobster films and glorify those characters in the movie. To her, it felt hypocritical and unfair. Today, I'm joined by Daniela Siggia-Beasant, author of Unseen Virtue, a journey through Mafia's approach to addiction. Daniela is here to discuss her life while her father was convicted and served time for drug crime conspiracies. Daniela, welcome to Empower. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
So let's begin by discussing your childhood and your life growing up. What was it like?
It's a bit of a dichotomy. I spent most of the time with my mother. It's of Italian heritage, but Northern and Southern Italian, very different. And my mother's side was quite law abiding, as was most of my father's. But my dad came to Canada in his teens at a time when Italians were vilified and certainly not welcome. And some people, if the opportunities aren't available to them, will create opportunities for themselves and will be willing to color outside the lines to make that happen. And my dad was one of those people. And he did get involved in criminality, cultural criminality when I was a child, and ended up convicted and more than once and served time more than once in prison. And later changed his life when he was middle-aged, and for the majority of his life has been a law-abiding citizen. But back in those days, he was quite notorious.
So you ended up very straight edge in terms of your deep respect for the law. Talk about watching your father go to jail and the family consequences.
It was devastating to the family, emotionally obvious, and the separation is terrible. But, the person that's in prison isn't really experiencing the fallout that the family is having. So it's the spouse and children that are dealing with having assets seized or your bank accounts frozen and trying to find a place to stay, and, the upheaval that comes. And then the instability during a very long trial period where you don't know what the outcome's going to be. You can't plan for the family, for the future. So it's very imposing on the family in a devastating way. And I certainly did not want to experience that in any capacity as an adult. It was very traumatizing.
Well, nobody does. Nobody wants to experience those ups and downs. But I want to turn to your book. Let's talk about your book, The Journey Through the Mafia's Approach to Addiction. Why did you write it, and what exactly is it?
I'm comparing how Canada currently deals with drug addiction in terms of our safe access, for example, and those sort of policies versus how criminal organizations deal with them within their ranks, which is very different. And I find that the criminal element actually has better outcomes than the government. And when the mafia is doing a better job than the government, I think it's time to have a conversation.
So, besides their approach to addiction, are there any other redeeming qualities the mafia has that society as a whole can learn from?
Definitely their business acumen. Many times there's money laundering involved, and you need a successful legal business that has the cash flow that enables you to do that laundering. So you need to have successful legal businesses as well as the illegal businesses, which are a very high risk, but entrepreneurial in nature, usually. So there's a huge business acumen. And one thing that they do very well is seeing who they have around them and what their skill set and natural talents are, and then building around that, as opposed to trying to shape a person into what you need for them to fill a slot. So it's a
So,
different approach.
well, it is a very different approach. When we come back, what we're going to do is talk about why you wrote this book. And then we're going to talk a little bit about women in the mafia, because, they basically say that women aren't allowed in the mob, but you have a different story. So Please don't go away. When we come back, we're going to hear a little bit more about what Daniela has to say and her experiences as well. Welcome back to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski. On today's episode, we're discussing how organized crime manages addiction within its ranks. So, Daniela, this is a very difficult topic. I have to ask you, why did you write this book?
I had a personal situation where I had an addict in my household, in my family, and I decided I had the Sicilian rehab offered to me, and I declined because I wanted to follow the law and do everything legally. And that had disastrous consequences because the way Canada manages addiction is severely lacking. And it made me wonder, had I taken the illegal route, would there have been a better outcome? And I felt that that was a conversation that should be had on paper.
That's very interesting. You and I were talking before about women in the mafia and, how they say that women aren't allowed in the mob, but we're completely involved behind the scenes and how that misogyny offended you. So tell us about that.
Well, I think the misogyny was a lie, and I think the women are a lot smarter than it appears, in the sense that I was told women weren't allowed and they had nothing to do with it. And so I felt it was misogynistic and it offended me. Like, I'm smart enough to be a criminal if I wanted. And but instead I learned through watching that sometimes the women, the wives, the mistresses, they had a lot of pull and a lot of say, and often were far more vicious than their male counterparts, but they had plausible deniability. So it was the men that went to prison and got shot, but the women were often, the what they say, behind every great man is a woman. That's very true in those circumstances, at least from what I saw at the time.
And that's interesting because none of that is portrayed in any of the movies that we all grew up with.
No, I remember being a witness in a court trial, a criminal trial, and the hired muscle was on the stand, and they were trying to get him to admit that the gentleman was making him do violent things, but when he was reading the text messages, the violent stuff was coming from the wife.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Okay, let's move on to Revenue Canada now because they're front and center in your life. Why did your father have deep respect for Revenue Canada and he loved the Canada's corporate tax system?
Yeah. And like I said, my father was, involved in criminality when he was a lot younger, but he had a long stretch in prison and that was enough for him. So when he got out, he got very lucky in business. And for the majority of his adult life was law abiding and very successful. And one law that he will not mess with is Canada's tax law. And it's not about not getting caught or because you can't get away with anything. For him, it's philosophical. He believes our tax laws are fair. He has no problem paying into a tax system for the privileges that we enjoy, and he's happy to contribute to that. And that's a stickler. Like, that is, for him, is something he's drilling into me all the time. Pay your taxes, don't mess with your taxes.
Well, Al Capone, wasn't he arrested because he didn't pay his taxes? So those are
But
wise words to live by.
But that's not why. Like, I thought that would be the reason why, but it's not. It actually, for him, is more philosophical. And he says that we have a fair tax system. What he says is that most Canadians don't learn the tax laws to know how to work with them. So, for example, one simple one, I know you love to talk about frugality on the show, is learning how to calculate mileage. How many Canadians lose thousands of dollars every year just because they don't report their mileage properly? And so he says that's not Revenue Canada's fault. That's our fault.
Mm-hmm.
They gave us the framework, work within that framework, and you'll do quite well.
That's really interesting. So we've got about a minute before we go to break. Want to know, we talked about when you were 9 years old. What happened to the other kids of your generation that you grew up with in that paradigm?
Thankfully, the majority went to school and moved on to other things. The ones that did follow suit, most of them are dead or went to prison. But many took their parents' businesses and just ran with it, let go of the criminality end of it, and just turned those into thriving enterprises.
Okay, well that's a good thing though, because it's nice to see that people that were in different situations actually took the positive and went their own positive way. So when we come back, we will keep discussing with Daniela her life, her father, addiction, the mob. And actually, Daniela was working for one of her father's companies. So we're going to find out what happened there when we come back. So please don't go away. Welcome back to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski. Today's episode, we're discussing how organized crime manages addiction within its ranks. Now, Daniela, you ended up working for one of your father's companies that was quite notorious in the used clothing business back in the violent days, and you sponsored the first Textile Waste Summit. So
Yeah.
what was that all about?
Textile Waste Summit and co-sponsored Canada's first textile waste audit and ran Canada's first municipal collection program for textile waste, all while that other stuff was happening.
Wow.
Yep. So, yeah, that was a proud part of my career for sure.
So, how did that come about? And the dichotomy of the criminality and then working for the government.
You have no idea. It was a crazy time. But, I had access to these businesses that were very clandestinely run, even though they were legal. It was many personalities that maybe at one time were involved in criminality, and that element definitely, went into this industry. And therefore, the industry wasn't being developed. They wanted to make their money today. They weren't looking at innovation, the future, growing or diversifying the industry at all, and it was just stagnating, and I had access. So I started partnering with municipalities, with colleges, and really started shining light on the industry and completely transformed it. Although I don't get the public credit for that, I know that I started the reason textiles waste is the trend that it is was a lot to do with my early work in that field.
Kudos to you. But now I'm going to
Thank
flip to that was a very positive thing that you did. But
you.
how did people use your father's criminal history
Oh,
against you in business? Because I'm sure
they
it
still
has been
do.
ongoing.
They still do. They still do. Even though what he did was 30 years ago and that he spent 30 years as a law-abiding businessman, I can't tell you how many times competitors will write anonymous letters every time they see a press release of something I'm doing with someone to say, oh, by the way, did you know her dad, blah, blah, blah. And I've had huge business deals dissolve over that. I had a charity that I donated $25,000 to and committed $100,000 that we had spent to build a recycling program with them. They got one of these anonymous letters, pulled out, but kept the money.
Oh,
And yep, kept the money, but wouldn't work with us. And I've had that happen a few times in my career. So a lot of the good work I've done is discredited by not something I did, but something somebody else did 30 years ago.
so let's talk about you now. You now work as a corporate political strategist consultant. Why did you decide to work for politics after everything that you've been through?
Because I see how politicians make decisions that impact industries, which impact families at the end of the day. So if you want to have an impact on the world in a positive way, politics is a really good way to be involved, as is media, because media has its problems too.
So let's talk about impact. Let's talk about the corruption that you witnessed as a child. How did that impact you and your future self?
It gave me faith in democracy, which I know sounds counterintuitive, but I learned that the majority of people in public service are there for the right reasons. And there's actually just a few that are self-serving, let's say, or corrupt. And I've also learned that even in situations where the majority are corrupt, one or two honest people can unravel, a big snake nest. So I've really learned the power of our democratic system and how it's bigger than the one or two jerks that might capitalize from it.
So you also feel that there is a crime that is ignored in Canada. What crime do you feel is ignored at Canada's peril?
Monopolization. If I could completely unravel and energize one ministry that we have that I feel is underutilized, that's our monopoly ministry, because it exists, but it doesn't have any teeth. And monopolization really, really is hurting Canada when it comes to economic development in industries like textile waste, but not just textile waste.
So we've got 30 seconds left before we go to break. What would you do to change it?
I would actually not allow the big monopolies we're seeing now, big corporate Goliaths that use regulation and the legacy media to push regulation to get the little mom and pop shops out. That happens a lot, where the big corporate Goliaths will use regulation to get rid of competition.
Okay, so please don't go away. When we come back, we will continue on with Daniela's journey and her childhood and what's happening now. Welcome back to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski. I'm joined by Daniela Siggia-Beasant, author, Unseen Virtue, A Journey Through Mafia's Approach to Addiction. Now, Daniela, we talked about you being successful in textile, but I want to know, how did you go from being a textile waste executive to public relations? Because they're like night and day.
Yes, but trial by fire is how I learned public relations, because when those industry Goliaths were using legacy media to push bias narrative that was changing regulations in a very negative way, I got caught in the crossfire and was getting some either really bad PR advice, or PR reps wouldn't work with me at all. Eventually, I found one awesome one, La Marie PR, and she was lovely. But other than that, I was on my own. So I had to learn for myself, and I became so effective at it that then other people started to ask me for assistance. And then that led to bigger projects, even outside of textile waste. And that had me put together a team of media professionals, because crafting a narrative needs the media that corresponds with that. And they were so phenomenal that it was like at one point we had to incorporate, because we were working all together but billing separately. So it became a nightmare every time we did a project, because our clients were getting 6 invoices. So we decided at this point we might as well make it official and turn it into a company, and it just grew from there.
So I need to ask, what was the particular moment that killed any hope of the mafia having you as a loyal subject for, the community factor?
It happened twice, once in childhood and once to cement that decision in early adulthood. As a child, when my father was involved, anybody that he knew that went to prison, my dad behaved in a certain way that I set that expectation for everybody. So he would make sure that, the family was taken care of and there was support for the kids. So when my dad went to prison, I expected that same level of support and didn't get it. So I started to learn that honor among thieves isn't necessarily true for all criminals, and that maybe the way my dad behaved wasn't true for everybody. And then sure enough, he was arrested again when I was a young adult, and the person that was supposed to protect me put me in a situation where I was vulnerable to being trafficked. And that really, I really saw the nefarious nature, especially when someone in that life, you really put a lot of trust and you go through a lot of trauma. There's a lot of trauma bonding. So the expectations of, that loyalty, like you see in the movies, right, is supposed to be great, but then the betrayals are also great. And I've seen, and catastrophic. It's not just that your feelings get hurt, people die, or horrible things happen to them. And I just didn't want to be a part of anything that could create anything so vile. And so there's no trust there for me. I've seen too much betrayal over the years.
So what exists today that a lot of us don't realize that you've known through your years of being exposed to the communities?
Slavery. Human slavery is a real true thing, and it's not just in places far away or in select industries like sex work. Slavery exists today. It exists in Canada. There are people that are used for common labor, even in Canada, and some really heartbreaking things happen. So slavery, often, we're so worried or consumed talking about the slavery of the past. It's a convenient distraction so that we don't talk about the slavery that exists here and now.
So, Daniela, last question. We've got 15 seconds left. What's the common stereotype that your exposure to criminality eradicated?
I have more compassion for sex workers and their clients than I ever did before. I found, we like to think of sex workers as victims and all of their customers are predators, and that exists, of course. However, I found some very empowered women working in sex work, and often their clients are just very lonely, and the only physical affection they will ever get is if they pay for it. And that reality really changed my level of judgment towards that.
Thank you so much, Daniela.
Thank you.
Daniela shared one interesting part of her life with me. She said that it was difficult for her to find her own identity outside of being her father's daughter, especially professionally. She also had to make peace with herself. The expectation to be as dynamic as her father was a lot of pressure she needed to free herself of. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski, and I'm here to empower you and make frugality fashionable. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for now.